I'm just a grandmother who once believed I would die in silence. That's how I always thought my story would end. Quietly. In a little house with peeling wallpaper, a bruised cheek hidden behind oversized glasses, and a heart too tired to cry anymore. I was 72 when I finally spoke the words no one expected to hear from a woman like me. A woman who wore silence like a second skin. A woman who cooked his meals, folded his shirts, and smiled politely while he slammed doors and shattered plates. You see, when you live with someone who hurts you, the pain becomes a rhythm. You learn to predict it, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes darken like storm clouds, the way the room suddenly goes cold, even if the sun is shining outside. You learn to breathe around the bruises, to speak only when spoken to, and to never ever cry where he can see you. People ask me sometimes, why didn't you leave? As if leaving was a door that had always been open. But when you've spent decades building a cage and calling it a home, you start to forget that you ever had wings. He wasn't always like that. Or maybe he was, and I just didn't see it. Maybe I didn't want to. I was 19 when we married. He was 25, charming in that silent, brooding way. The kind of man who didn't say I love you, but bought you coffee the way you liked it and opened the door when your hands were full. That was enough for me then. Back then, I believed love looked like sacrifice. I thought bruises could be explained away, that anger was just stress, that someday he'd see how much I gave and he'd finally soften. But decades passed, and he only grew harder. And I disappeared. Slowly, quietly, like a whisper fading into wallpaper, until the day he hit me in front of my grandchildren. They were only visiting for the weekend. Lily was 6, Ben 4. We were all in the kitchen. I had accidentally spilled his coffee on the table, and the next thing I knew, his hand was in the air and then on my face. Just like that. No warning, no shame. The silence that followed was heavier than any slap. Lily's eyes welled with tears. Ben clutched my apron, and something inside me, something ancient and quiet, cracked wide open. That was the moment I decided no more. He didn't know it then, but something in me had shifted. For the first time in 50 years, I saw my life not as a duty, but as something worth reclaiming. That was the day silence died. That was the day my story began. After that slap right there in front of Lily and Ben, I didn't cry. Not in front of them. I smiled, wiped my face, and handed Lily a napkin as if nothing had happened. That's the thing about women like me. We don't fall apart in front of children. We protect their innocence even when ours has long since been shattered. Later that night, after the kids had fallen asleep upstairs, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and traced the faint outline of his handprint on my cheek. It wasn't the worst bruise he'd ever left on me, but it was the one that hurt the most. I stared at that reflection for a long time. My face didn't look like mine anymore. It looked like hers, the woman I swore I'd never become. The woman who apologized when she was hurt. The woman who believed love meant loyalty even if it broke her. The woman who smiled through pain because she didn't know what else to do. I had followed the good wife script all my life. You know the one. Be quiet. Don't complain. Cook his meals. Keep his secrets. And if he ever raises his voice or his hand, blame yourself for setting him off. I followed that script for over 50 years. Through 2 miscarriages. Through 4 jobs he made me quit. Through every slammed door and shattered plate and Sunday morning where I sat alone in church pretending everything was fine. Even when my son Jacob moved away and barely called, I didn't question the silence. I just assumed he had his reasons. After all, wasn't I taught that love means patience, that enduring is what strong women do? But that night, I sat on the toilet seat still staring at myself in the mirror, and I finally said it out loud. This isn't love. The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to me. But they echoed around the room, bouncing off tiled walls like a truth too long buried. And then came the second truth. I deserve better. I clutched the sink with both hands, feeling my knees tremble not from weakness, but from the weight of awakening. And then I laughed. Softly, because saying it out loud didn't break me, it made me stronger. I went to bed that night and lay beside the same man who had hit me. He slept like nothing had happened. That's the thing about men like him, they forget. Or maybe they never thought it mattered in the first place. But I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, rewriting my life in my head. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't planning tomorrow's meals or folding his laundry in my mind. I was planning my escape. He didn't know it, but I had already started packing. Not bags, not clothes. I was packing my voice, my will, my story. Because if there's one thing abusers fear more than anything, it's a woman who's done being quiet. It's funny how you can live with someone for over 5 decades and still feel like a stranger in your own home. The house we lived in wasn't grand, it never was, but I made it feel like home, or at least I tried. Yellow curtains in the kitchen, crocheted blankets on the couch, a little porcelain angel that sat near the window collecting dust and sunlight. All those little touches that said, I live here, I belong. But deep down, I never really did. This was his house, his furniture, his rules, his silence. When I first married him, I thought I was stepping into love. I didn't realize I was walking into a cage that only looked like a home. I remember the first time he hit me. It wasn't with a fist. No, it was a look. A glare so sharp, it sliced right through me during our first year of marriage when I accidentally burned dinner. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. That glare told me everything I needed to know. I had disappointed him. And disappointment was dangerous. The second time, it was a shove. We were arguing about money. He wanted to buy a new TV. I said we couldn't afford it. He pushed me. Not hard enough to bruise, but enough to make a point. Over the years, those points turned into patterns. Shouting turned into slaps. Slaps turned into shoves. Shoves turned into me flinching every time he walked into a room. But I hid it well. I wore long sleeves in the summer, smiled too much at church, laughed off the bruises with stories about bumping into cabinets. And everyone believed me because I was the nice one, the loyal wife, the quiet grandmother who never made a fuss. Sometimes I even convinced myself it wasn't that bad. At least he didn't break my bones. At least he wasn't drunk. At least the kids didn't see. At least, God, how many at leasts does it take before you realize you've settled for pain? When Jacob left home, he barely looked back. At first I blamed him, but as the years passed, I started to wonder if he left because he couldn't stand watching me wither. Maybe he saw something I didn't want to admit, that I wasn't just a victim. I was a volunteer. But the thing about silence is, it rots you from the inside out. It starts as a coping mechanism, a way to avoid the next fight. Then it becomes a habit, and eventually it becomes a belief. This is all I'm worth. This is all I'll ever have. I told myself I was staying for the family, for stability, for the kids. But in truth, I stayed because I was afraid. Afraid of what people would say. Afraid I wouldn't survive on my own. Afraid no one would believe me if I finally told the truth. And yet, after that slap in front of Lily and Ben, I knew the truth didn't need anyone's permission anymore. I didn't care what people said. I cared what they saw. My grandchildren. Their eyes. Their little faces frozen in shock. That moment kept replaying in my head like a broken lullaby. And something inside me, the part of me I thought had died long ago, started to come alive again. That week, I started writing things down. Memories, incidents, dates, names, proof. Not because I wanted revenge, at least not at first, but because I needed to remind myself, this happened. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. It was real, and I had the right to name it. I wasn't ready to run yet, but I was preparing. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't hiding anymore. The morning after I started writing everything down, I sat in the kitchen staring at my journal like it was something sacred. It was just a cheap spiral-bound notebook I bought from the corner store. But to me, it felt like a lifeline. Each word I wrote was a piece of truth I had buried. Each page was a memory I'd once tried to forget. And with every sentence, I felt like I was reclaiming myself one line at a time. That morning, he walked into the kitchen same as always, like nothing had happened the day before. He grunted something about coffee, then sat down in front of the TV. He didn't apologize. He never did. I made the coffee, handed it to him, and he didn't even look me in the eye. But I looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see the man I married. I saw the man I had endured. And there was a difference. He wasn't stronger than me. He had just been louder, and I had been quiet, but not anymore. I took my journal out onto the porch that day and wrote 3 simple words. I remember everything. The porch was the only place in the house that ever felt like mine. I used to sit there with my knitting, or a book, or sometimes just a cup of tea and a few stolen moments of peace. But now, it became my war room, my chapel, my space to breathe. That afternoon, I picked up the phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Martha, my old neighbor from 3 houses down. We used to be close when we were younger before the shame and the bruises made me pull away from everyone. When she picked up, her voice cracked with surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. Ruth, is that really you?" I hadn't heard my name spoken so warmly in a long time. We talked for nearly an hour. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I hinted. I asked about her kids, about her husband, who had passed about the neighborhood. And then just before hanging up, I asked softly, "Do you know a good lawyer?" There was a pause. She didn't ask why. She just said, "Yes. And when you're ready, I'll take you there myself." I hung up and cried. Not because I was sad, but because someone had offered me help, and I had accepted it. That night, he yelled because dinner was cold. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him while he ranted, and I realized his voice didn't scare me anymore. It annoyed me. It grated, but it didn't paralyze me. He stormed off to the garage. I stayed at the table looking at my journal, and I made a list, not of things I needed to buy or chores I needed to finish. I made a list of the things I had lost and the things I still had left. Things I lost. My youth. My voice, my confidence, my connection with Jacob, things I still had, my mind, my hands, my story, my freedom, if I chose to take it. That night I didn't sleep again, but it wasn't anxiety this time, it was planning, not petty revenge, something deeper, smarter, because what he didn't know was that I had started remembering everything. And when a woman remembers, she also begins to rise. The next week was quiet. Too quiet. He hadn't raised his hand again since the incident in front of the kids. I think he sensed something in me had shifted, though he didn't understand what. Men like him never think the silence they enforced could one day turn on them. He probably assumed I was sulking, that I'd fall back into line like always. But what he didn't realize was that I was no longer living in silence. I was building something inside it. Each morning, I kept to my routines, made breakfast, folded the laundry, tidied the living room. Outwardly, nothing had changed. I played the same role, walked the same halls, wore the same apron. But inside, I was rehearsing my exit. I had memorized the phone number of the lawyer Martha gave me. I had copied every important document, marriage license, property deeds, utility bills, tax returns, and stored them in a shoebox labeled winter clothes on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. He never touched my things, not because he respected me, but because he never cared enough to look. And I wrote, God, did I write? Every slap, every bruise, every cruel word. I turned years of buried wounds into paragraphs. I wrote the date he threw my ceramic vase against the wall because his soup was too salty. I described the time he twisted my wrist in the car because I said the wrong thing in front of his brother. I even wrote about the night Jacob left home, how my husband blamed me for raising a soft son, then didn't speak to me for 3 days. I wasn't just writing a journal. I was writing evidence. Martha called me every other day now. She never pushed, never pried. She just talked, listened, reminded me that I had options. It felt good to have a friend again. Jacob still hadn't returned my calls. I couldn't blame him. I had spent so many years defending his father, brushing things under the rug, that I had no right to expect him to come running now. But I held on to hope not for rescue, but for reconciliation. Someday, one afternoon, while my husband was napping in his recliner with the TV blaring baseball highlights, I slipped out and walked to the post office. Inside my purse, I had a manila envelope addressed to the lawyer's office. It held copies of my notes, some photos of past bruises I'd secretly taken over the years, and a handwritten letter titled, "If anything happens to me." I mailed it with trembling fingers. I wasn't sure what scared me more, what he might do if he found out, or what might happen if I did nothing. That night, he came to bed smelling like beer. He didn't say anything, just grunted and rolled over. And I stared at the ceiling again, only this time I smiled. He still thought I was afraid. He didn't know I was planning the storm. He didn't know I had begun planting seeds in the dark. And soon, he'd see just how much can grow. In silence. It was a rainy Thursday when the doorbell rang. He was asleep in his recliner again, snoring with his mouth half open. I was folding towels at the kitchen table, white ones, the kind I always kept for guests we never had. When I opened the door, I froze. Jacob, my son, my boy. I hadn't seen him in nearly 4 years. He looked older, thinner, a little more tired, but still him. Those same eyes that used to look up at me while I read him bedtime stories now looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time: concern. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Martha called me." I didn't realize I was crying until he reached out and gently placed his hand on my shoulder. The tears came quietly, just like everything else in my life until now. I stepped back, and he walked in his eyes, scanning the living room, then the hallway, then resting on the recliner where his father slept. He didn't say anything, neither did I. We sat at the kitchen table, the towels forgotten between us. "I'm sorry I left," he said after a moment. I shook my head. "Don't be. I should have left first." His eyes welled up. "Martha said you asked for a lawyer," he said softly. I nodded. "I did." "I'll pay for everything," he added quickly. "Whatever you need. I didn't know it was still happening. I thought that I was fine." I smiled bitterly. "I made sure you thought that." He looked down at the table, his fingers running over the stitching of one of the towels. "I used to hear him at night," Jacob whispered, "yelling, breaking things. I remember hiding in the closet once when I was 7. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, it would go away." I reached for his hand. "I stayed quiet for 50 years. He looked at me, his eyes wide with sorrow and something else, respect. "Are you really going to leave?" he asked. I took a deep breath. Yes. His shoulders dropped, a sigh of relief escaping his lips. Good. We sat there in silence for a long time, not needing to fill it with anything. That moment was enough, a mother and son, separated by shame, reunited by truth. Then came the sound of the recliner creaking. Jacob stiffened. My husband shuffled into the hallway, scratching his belly eyes, bleary and annoyed. "Who the hell is at the door?" When he saw Jacob, his expression twisted. Well, well, look who decided to come crawling back." Jacob didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, taller than I remembered, steady and calm. "I didn't come for you," he said. "I came for my mother." For a split second, I saw something I'd never seen before: my husband's face, pale with surprise. But he recovered quickly, scoffing and waving his hand. "She doesn't need you. She has me." I stood then too. "No," I said. "I had you, and now I have me." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was powerful. My husband didn't respond. He turned and shuffled back to the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. I looked at Jacob, and we both exhaled. He stayed for dinner. Nothing fancy, just soup and warm bread, but it was the first meal I'd made in years where I didn't feel like I was feeding a prison warden. We talked about his job, his apartment in the city, the girl he was dating. We laughed. We healed, even just a little. When he left that night, he hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mom." And as I watched him walk away in the rain, I knew something for certain. The past had lost its power, and the future was finally mine to shape. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The air felt different. Not freer yet, but clearer, like the room had finally opened its windows after years of stale breath and silence. He was still asleep when I walked into the living room. I paused for a moment staring at him. His face was slack, open-mouthed, peaceful in a way he never was when awake. It was strange to look at the man who had spent years controlling me and feel nothing. Not hate, not fear, not love, just emptiness. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my journal. Today, I wrote something different. Not an incident, not another list. A letter, not for the lawyer, not for Martha, not even for Jacob. It was for him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed it. To the man I once loved, I gave you everything. My youth, my dreams, my body, my silence. I stitched your life together while you unraveled mine. I endured your rage, your fists, your indifference. And I stayed because I believed love was endurance. But I've learned something now. Love doesn't raise its hand. Love doesn't shame. Love doesn't silence. You didn't love me. You owned me. But that ends today. You will never hit me again. You will never make me feel small again. You will never confuse fear with devotion again. I'm leaving you. I'm taking my voice, my story, my life. You won't see it coming, because I'll leave like I lived quietly. But this time, that silence will be mine. Ruth. I folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, then tucked it into the same shoebox with the documents. I had no intention of giving it to him. I didn't need to. Writing it was enough. That day, I made an appointment with the lawyer Martha recommended. Her name was Linda. Mid-40s, sharp, kind, no nonsense. The kind of woman who looked you in the eye and saw you not your shame, not your age, not your bruises. When I stepped into her office, my hands were shaking. But she greeted me like an old friend offered tea and didn't once flinch as I told her my story. Not the whole thing, not yet, but enough. She listened. She took notes. She nodded. And when I finally paused to breathe, she leaned forward and said, "Ruth, we can get you out, on your terms, with protection." I didn't cry until I got back home. He was in the garage fixing something that probably didn't need fixing. I walked past him into the house and closed the door behind me like I had done 1,000 times before. But this time, something was different. I had a plan. I had support. I had a lawyer. And most of all, I had written the letter. Not for him, but for the woman I used to be. The one who thought she'd die in silence. I wanted her to know we made it. A week later, I bought a lockbox. Just a small steel one from the hardware store. Nothing fancy. But when I held it in my hands, I felt like I was holding something far more precious than cold metal. I was holding my future guarded for the first time. I brought it home and hid it in the back of the hall closet behind a pile of old blankets he never touched. Inside, I placed everything. Copies of the documents, my handwritten letter, my journal, the lawyer's business card, a spare set of keys to Jacob's apartment, cash just enough to leave in a hurry if I needed to. It was my emergency exit disguised in steel. He still hadn't noticed anything. He probably thought I was back to normal, that things were settled, that Ruth, his obedient wife, had tucked her little tantrum back into the drawer with all her other unspoken thoughts. That's the thing about men like him. They believe silence equals surrender. What he didn't realize was that this silence was strategy. He went back to his old rhythms, watching TV too loud, complaining about dinner slamming drawers. But the hitting had stopped. At first, I thought maybe he sensed I was slipping away. But no, he wasn't afraid of losing me. He just thought if he left me unbruised, I'd stay longer. He never cared about my pain, just the illusion of control. Every day, I walked the house with new eyes. I noticed escape routes. I paid attention to the locks on the windows. I timed how long it took to walk from the kitchen to the front door. I memorized the sound of his truck's engine when it turned off outside. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. One night, while he was watching an old Western and I was crocheting on the porch, I pulled out my phone and texted Jacob. "It's almost time. Will you be ready?" He replied within minutes. "Just say the word, Mom. We're ready whenever you are." Turns out Jacob had told his girlfriend about everything. Her name was Lena, and she worked in women's advocacy. She had even offered me a temporary place to stay if I needed it quiet safe with other women like me. I hadn't accepted yet. I wasn't ready to vanish. Not just yet. I wanted to leave on my own terms. With dignity, with a plan, with proof. So I started recording. I downloaded a voice recorder app on my phone and hid it beneath a basket of yarn on the kitchen counter. Every time he yelled, every insult, every threat, I pressed record. It was terrifying and empowering. Every file I saved felt like another crack in the wall he'd built around me. I gave the files to Linda, the lawyer, at our next meeting. She nodded with satisfaction and said, "Keep them coming. Every minute matters." I nodded back, feeling like a soldier handing over battlefield intel. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. And every day I stayed, I gathered one more stone to lay on the path toward my freedom. One more layer of armor. One more line in a story he never thought I'd live to tell. He didn't know I had a lockbox. He didn't know I had an army. And most of all, he didn't know I had myself back. It happened on a Sunday. Of course it did. Sunday was his favorite day to play the good husband. Church shirt, too much cologne, a fake smile he reserved for the neighbors, and the old ladies who still believed men like him were pillars of the community. But behind closed doors, Sunday was the day he punished me for everything. I wasn't quiet enough, grateful enough, obedient enough. That morning started like any other. He grumbled about the sermon, barked at the dog, and complained that his eggs were too wet, whatever that meant. I kept my face still calm, like I always had. But I was boiling, not just from the eggs, not just from the noise, but from years of Sunday mornings like this. When he left to go to the garage, I slipped into the bedroom and opened the lockbox. I took out a flash drive with the most recent recordings, his threats, his slurs, the way he spoke about me like I was a burden he regretted carrying. I put it into an envelope and wrote one word on the outside: insurance. I planned to give it to Linda the next morning, but that night, the plan got fast-tracked. We were eating dinner in silence. The kind of silence that had always filled our meals, him chewing like a king, me quietly cutting my chicken, pretending I had an appetite. Then out of nowhere, he slammed his fork down. "You've been smug lately," he said. I looked up. "What do you mean?" "Don't play stupid," he snapped. "You walk around here like you've got some damn secret. Like you're better than me all of a sudden." I didn't answer. Because he was right. I did have a secret. I was better than him. "Maybe," I said softly, "I just don't care anymore." His face twisted. Red. Boiling. The same rage I'd seen 100 times before. But this time, I didn't flinch. He stood up so fast the chair scraped across the floor. For a moment, I thought he was going to do it, hit me again. And maybe he would have. But this time, something stopped him. Me. I stood too, slowly, calmly. And I said, "Go ahead, do it." He froze. "Go ahead," I repeated. "One more time. But just know this, your voice, it's been recorded. Your threats saved. Your words sent. You lay one finger on me tonight, and by morning, you'll be in a courtroom." He blinked, his lips parted, but no sound came out. I had never seen him speechless before. It was beautiful. "You think I'm scared of you?" I whispered. "Not anymore. I've lived through you. And now I'm walking away from you." I turned and walked to the kitchen. He didn't follow. He didn't slam anything. He didn't say a word. That night, I didn't pack a bag. I didn't run. Instead, I wrote the final entry in my journal. He blinked first. The storm had come, and I hadn't just survived it. I'd stood tall in the center of it, eyes open, heart steady. The woman he thought would stay silent forever had just declared war. And I wasn't done yet. I woke up the next morning to birdsong. It was strange, peaceful, almost surreal. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft light on the walls I had once called home. But this time, I didn't feel trapped inside them. I felt ready to leave them behind. He was still asleep. For the first time in years, I stood in the doorway and just watched him. Not with fear, not with sadness, but with clarity. This was the man who had stolen 5 decades from me, and I was about to steal the rest of them back. I didn't pack a suitcase. I had already moved the important things. The envelope for Linda mailed, the flash drive duplicated and stored in 2 places, the spare clothes and documents already at Jacob's. I made myself one final cup of coffee in that kitchen. No rush, no panic, just me and the silence. And for once, the silence was mine. I looked around the house. The living room with the recliner where he spent his afternoons. The photos on the wall, family portraits that looked like happiness but held so many secrets. The hallway mirror where I used to check my bruises and practice my fake smiles. And I whispered one last goodbye. Not to him, to her, the version of me that stayed too long. Then I walked out the front door. No yelling, no slamming, no begging. I left like a ghost, but with the power of a hurricane behind me. Jacob was waiting in his car at the end of the street. He got out when he saw me rushed over and pulled me into a hug so tight I thought my bones would crack. But I didn't mind. That hug was the first time in years I felt safe in someone's arms. "You sure?" he asked gently. I nodded, more than ever. We drove in silence for a while. I watched the town pass by the grocery store I used to walk to in the mornings, the library I stopped going to once he started checking on me, the church where I prayed to feel seen. Now I didn't need to be seen. I had seen myself. When we reached his apartment, Lena opened the door with a warm smile. She had set up a guest room for me. Clean linens, a candle on the nightstand, a window that opened wide. That first night in their home, I slept with the window open and the door unlocked. And I dreamed, not of him, not of the past, but of what came next. Because for the first time in my life, I was free, and freedom doesn't scream when it arrives. It walks quietly out the front door, head held high, never looking back. 3 days after I moved in with Jacob and Lena, the letter arrived. It was a standard envelope, white, unassuming, no return address. But I knew the handwriting. Slanted, aggressive. All caps as if he'd carved each word into the paper with spite. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at it for a long moment. Jacob walked by and paused. "Do you want me to open it?" "No," I said softly. "I need to see it." He stayed close as I slid my finger under the flap and pulled the paper free. "You've embarrassed me. People are asking questions. You walk out and think you can just leave? You'll regret this. Don't forget whose name is on everything." There was no Ruth, no dear, no signature, just a scribbled warning and a final sentence. "Come home, while you still can." I folded the letter neatly and placed it in my journal. It didn't scare me, not anymore. He was bluffing. I had already spoken to Linda. Legally, he couldn't touch me. The paperwork was in motion. The protective orders were coming. The bank accounts frozen pending review. The house under scrutiny because of past threats. He could roar all he wanted, but the world was finally listening to me. That night, I sat on the edge of the guest bed and wrote him back. No, not to send, but to say what needed to be said for me. To the man who used my silence as a weapon. I am not afraid of you anymore. Your name may be on the deeds, but I hold the truth. And the truth, it has weight. It has witnesses. It has proof. I gave you everything, and you gave me bruises and broken years. But I took my name back. I took my story back. You say I've embarrassed you? You should be embarrassed, not by me, but by what you did. I'm not coming back. I don't belong to you. I never did. Ruth, Lena brought me a cup of tea that night, and we sat on the balcony together under the stars. You're stronger than most women I know, she said. I smiled faintly. I wasn't. Not for a long time. You were surviving. That's still strength. Her words sat with me long after she went to bed, because for so long I had believed survival was weakness. that staying quiet was cowardice. But now, I understood the truth. Survival was what kept me alive long enough to fight back. And fighting back didn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it meant writing a letter you never send. Sometimes it meant walking away and never returning. Sometimes it simply meant finally knowing you were never the problem. It was a rainy Tuesday when we walked into the courthouse. The clouds hung low, heavy with the kind of gray that presses against your chest, but I felt light. Nervous, yes, but not afraid. I wasn't alone anymore. Jacob held one arm. Lena held the other. And behind us, Linda carried a folder filled with documents, photos, recordings, and truth. My truth. It wasn't a criminal trial. Not yet. But it was a hearing that mattered: protective order, financial separation, temporary rights to the home. It was the first time in over 50 years that I was standing opposite of him instead of beside him. He was there, same suit he wore to church, same slicked back hair. But his eyes, they didn't hold fire. They held panic. The courtroom was a stage where the script had changed, and for once, I was holding the pen. I didn't have to say much. Linda spoke for me. But when the judge asked if I wanted to make a statement, I stood. My knees trembled as I walked to the center of that room. But my voice did not shake. My name is Ruth. I am 72 years old. I was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and for 53 years, I was also a prisoner. I never saw bars, but I lived in a cage. I cooked, I cleaned, I smiled for guests. I also bled. I flinched. I hid bruises. I was hit, humiliated, and silenced in my own home. And I stayed quiet because I was taught that's what wives do. But silence is not love, and survival is not surrender. I'm not here to ask for pity. I'm here to reclaim my voice. Because I may be old, but I am not invisible. And I will not die with this story untold. The room was still. Even he didn't look at me. The judge nodded once. That was all. Then she ruled in my favor. Protective order approved. Immediate asset freeze. Pending review of ownership. It was done. We stepped out of the courtroom, and I felt something unfasten in my chest, like a curtain being pulled back after decades of darkness. Jacob cried when we reached the car. Lena squeezed my hand like she was grounding me to the earth. And I exhaled. I had faced him and walked away whole. That night, I took a long shower. Not just to wash the day away, but the years, the fear, the grip of someone else's control. When I dried off, I looked in the mirror. No bruises, no makeup, no mask. Just me. Ruth. A woman reborn, not with youth, but with something far more powerful. Truth. The days that followed felt like spring after a brutal winter. There were no parades, no music, no sudden bursts of sunshine. Just stillness. A quiet so unfamiliar, I wasn't sure what to do with it at first. I kept waiting for the door to slam, for footsteps in the hallway, for a voice to bark my name. But the silence held, and slowly I began to understand it wasn't empty. It was sacred. I was free, truly, finally, beautifully free. Lena taught me how to use the apps on my phone, how to order groceries, how to check my email, how to stream music. It made me feel foolish at first, fumbling with things younger women used without a second thought. But she was patient and kind, and she never made me feel slow or outdated, just new. Jacob took me to lunch once a week. We'd walk to a little cafe near his office where the waitresses called him sweetheart and me ma'am, and always gave me extra lemon in my tea when I asked. He told me about his childhood, not the version I thought I had given him, but the real one. The one where he hid in closets, where he heard every argument, where he saw every bruise, and learned how to stay invisible. I didn't know how to help you, he said one afternoon, eyes lowered. I didn't even know if you wanted help. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. I didn't know I could be helped, I whispered. That's what abuse does. It makes you believe you're unworthy of rescue. That silence is safer than speaking. That endurance is nobility. That suffering is love. But every day I lived outside of that house, I began to shed those beliefs like old skin. I slept through the night without fear. I read books without hiding the covers. I wore short sleeves in public without checking my arms first. I even joined a support group Lena suggested, Voices Unbroken, they called it. Women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. All of us with stories. Some worse than mine. Some more subtle. But all of them familiar. We laughed. We cried. We sat in that little circle of folding chairs and rewrote the definition of strength together. One day a woman named Carol turned to me and asked, "What does freedom feel like to you, Ruth?" I paused for a long time before answering. And then I said, "It feels like finally being able to breathe in a room that used to suffocate me." They nodded, because they understood. I wasn't just out of his house. I was out of his shadow. And for the first time, I could see my own. Strong, sharp, steady. Mine. It had been nearly 4 months since I walked out when the call came. Linda phoned that morning, her voice calm but cautious. "He's sick, Ruth. Very sick. In the hospital. Stage 4. They don't think he'll last the week." For a moment, I didn't say anything. The words hung in the air, weightless but heavy. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel. Relief, just as sadness. All I felt was stillness, Linda continued. "They say he's been asking for you." I sat at the kitchen table for hours after I hung up. Jacob didn't push me. He sat with me quiet present and said, "Whatever you decide, Mom, I'll support it." The next morning, I asked him to drive me to the hospital. Not because I forgave the man who broke me, but because I needed to look him in the eye one last time. Not as his wife, not as his possession, but as Ruth, the woman who survived him. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet grief. Room 219. I remember every step it took to get there, every beat of my heart as we turned the corner. And there he was, small, frail, tubes in his nose, skin pale and sunken. The man who once loomed like a giant in my life now looked like a shadow thinner than I'd ever seen him. When he saw me, his eyes flickered. Surprise, maybe. Shame, I didn't know. I stepped into the room. Jacob stayed in the hallway. My husband opened his mouth, his voice dry and cracked. "I didn't think you'd come." I said nothing. I didn't mean to. I didn't know I was that bad. I almost laughed. Almost. "You didn't know," I said softly. "You knew. You just didn't care." He closed his eyes. A tear slipped out. I was angry. I didn't know how to be anything else. I leaned forward, just enough so he could hear me clearly. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt our son. You damaged years I can never get back. But I'm still here. I found my voice. And you're facing the silence you forced on me for half a century." He said nothing. There were no more excuses. No more shouting. Just a bed, a man fading, and the woman he never expected to outgrow him. I stood there for a few moments more, watching him breathe. Then I said the words I had rehearsed in my heart for weeks. "I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean return. It doesn't mean you're right. It just means you don't get to own me anymore." And with that, I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't look back. I walked past the nurses, past the waiting room, past the echoes of everything I used to be. And when I stepped outside into the afternoon light, I breathed in deep, free, clean, whole. It's been a year now, 12 months since I walked out of that house. 365 days since I found the courage to say enough. A season for every part of my healing. I live in a small cottage now. Just mine. A little place with white curtains, a porch swing, and flowers I planted with my own hands. It's quiet, but not the kind of silence that smothers. It's a peace I earned. Jacob visits often. He brings groceries I didn't ask for and jokes I didn't know I needed. Lena texts me every week, usually a recipe or an encouraging quote. And once a month, we all sit down for dinner, not out of duty, but because we want to. Because we're finally free to love without fear. Sometimes I sit with my tea and look back not to relive it, but to remember. I remember the girl I was at 19, full of hope and dressed in white. I remember the woman I became at 39, scared and shrinking. I remember the grandmother I was at 69, bruised in front of her grandchildren. And I remember the moment it all changed, when I realized that the strength I needed was never gone. It had just been waiting for me, waiting for the day I'd stop surviving and start living. There's a box I keep in the back of my closet now, the lockbox I call it still. But it no longer holds evidence or fear. Now it holds letters from other women. Women who've heard my story. Women from support groups. Women I've met in cafes and church basements online. They send me their stories, some whispered, some raw, all real. They write, I'm still in it, but I see the door now. I didn't think I had options until I heard about you. I'm planning my exit. Wish me luck. To them I say, you are not weak because you stayed. You are not wrong because you hoped. You are not broken because you were hurt. But you are worthy of safety, of softness, of joy, of freedom. I'm just a grandmother, but I am also a woman who walked through hell and made it out barefoot, bruised, and bold. If you're reading this, if you're still waiting, if you're still whispering your pain into a pillow at night, let me tell you this, there is life after silence, and it's louder than you ever imagined. You are not too late. You are not too old. You are not too far gone. You are just beginning. What would you have done if you were in my place? And what will you do now, knowing you're not alone? This is my story. But it can be your turning point. With all the love I have,